Thank you, Mr. Cohen. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Wolfman, who decides whether the government position was substantially justified?
Either the court or the agency adjudicator, depending on whether it's an administrative case or a court case.
Who has the burden of proof?
The government has the burden to show its position was not substantially justified, but in practice that makes no difference because there's no factual determination. So burdens usually only matter when facts are at stake. It's a legal question.
What's the standard of proof by which it must be proven?
A preponderance of the evidence, just like any other civil matter.
You mentioned a few moments ago the importance of having data, so I'm hopeful you will have the data for this because I don't. The percentage of cases where plaintiffs prevailed, but the court said the government's position was substantially justified.
That's an interesting question. And in the area of the Social Security and veterans cases, particularly veterans cases, it's very high that it usually doesn't even go to court. The agency.
What about environmental cases?
But in non-Social Security and veterans cases, and I haven't done a study, so I'm just based on my experience, the government wins often. I cite just what I did in my testimony is that I just said I'm looking for cases in recent years in courts of appeals where the court found.
No, I think you did a good job with anecdotal evidence. I was looking for statistical evidence.
I don't know of any study on that. I don't know of any study that. I know in the non-Social
You do not know what percentage of the time plaintiffs prevail, but still were not allowed to recoup fees because a finder of fact.
I don't know that anyone knows that. It would be, again, an interesting study. But I will say this, because I know it for a fact, is that in the non-Social Security and veterans areas, it's much higher than in those areas.
You once, I believe, and I don't want to mischaracterize your positions because I didn't know you in 1994, but you once, I believe, supported the notion of doing away with a special factor exemption. Do you still support that?
What I said was at that time, and I have to look back for sure, is that if we chose a more reasonable rate that could go up with fees, actual fees in the real market, as opposed to what has occurred, yes. Because
right, I think you said $175. We go up to $175, we'd do away with it.
With all respect, that would not be the case because...
I'm just asking you if you said it. I'm not asking you if you meant it.
No, with all respect, that was $175 in 1994 dollars.
$250.
That is correct. If we were at
what if we went up to $250? Would you do away with it then?
I think if we were at $250 an hour and we had a reasonable inflation adjuster, right?
We just adjusted for inflation. We just bumped it from 175 to 250.
And if you had a mandatory reasonable inflation adjuster, I'm with you.
Then you would be fine doing away with it.
I think that would be reasonable rather than necessarily what we have now. You have to appreciate that in the vast majority of the cases, what the attorneys get and the clients get is the basic EJA rate plus an inflation adjustment, except at the agencies, which largely don't do any inflation adjustment.
All right, let me ask you this, because I'm running out of time quickly. I think you said there are 203 instances where we have something other than the American rule with respect to litigation and who pays the fees.
Someone else said 203. I know it's approximately 200, yes.
Are you an advocate for abolishing the American rule in all litigation and letting the finder of fact decide whether or not...
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think that if you...
You hadn't heard my idea yet. Why don't we let the finder of fact decide whether or not litigation was frivolous or vexatious?
Well, I can answer your question if you allow me.
I'm going to. I wanted to get my question out.
I think having essentially the rule in Great Britain would deny ordinary citizens.
What I just laid out is not Great Britain's rule. I didn't say loser pays. I said the finder of fact decides. The same group that we let decide capital cases, the same group that we let decide whether there's liability in a medical malpractice case or a products case, let the finder of fact decide whether or not the lawsuit was frivolous or vexatious.
Well, first of all,
that's not the British rule, agreed?
That is correct. I didn't know that's what you were saying, but I'll say two things about that. First of all, that is already the law in the sense that
Well, wait a second. Can you name me a single time? How many times when summary judgment is granted or a motion to dismiss is granted, does the judge then award attorney's fees for filing a frivolous lawsuit? In what percentage of the cases
Very small
does that
percentage
happen?
because there's not.
Well,
many
then we
frivolous
don't have
cases.
that rule.
Well, excuse me?
Well, then we don't have
We do
the
have
rule.
that rule. With all respect, we do have that rule. Rule 11 applies in every piece of civil litigation.
How many times has it been enforced? In summary judgment cases, and just for the viewer, that is where there is no dispute over fact, just the law. What percentage of time in summary judgment cases are sanctions administered for frivolous lawsuits?
Well, not often, but that I don't. With all respect, I don't think that proves anything because all that means is there's not that many frivolous cases on purely legal matters. I mean, you can laugh with all respect.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying.
Correct.
I mean, well, then we don't need Rule 11. Well, then we must not need Rule 11 if there are no frivolous lawsuits.
No, I didn't say there were none. Rule 11 provides an important incentive. But let me give you the other reason why I think that would be a poor idea. If you decided fee shifting at the back end, right, if you decided frivolity at the back end only and didn't have the 200 fee shifters at the front end, you wouldn't have the encouragement that these fee shifters that come at the front end are intended to give litigants to enforce our important civil rights, environmental, consumer laws.
We lose an incentive to litigate, to bring lawsuit because there may be a penalty on the back end if you lose.
This is a debate that people can have. The Congress of the United States has decided that it's important on the front end in over 200 instances to provide that incentive.
You're right, and I'm asking you if it's important in the rest of all the category of cases. If it does well in these 200,
I think probably not. In my judgment, it makes sense for the Congress to decide which types of litigation it wants to incentivize and not do it on an across-the-board basis.
My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The House Appropriations Committee was quoted in their report as saying, quote, disappointed that an agency dedicated to transparency and accountability was not more forthcoming about how it plans to spend the taxpayer money. It also went on in there to say, quote, in the absence of this fine print, the committee cannot discern what the Consumer Financial Protection Board plans to do, how it will do it, or how much it will cost. Given that your agency is about to open up here in about a week, how do the taxpayers, how do we see what you're going to do and how you're going to do it?
Well, Congressman, we started 5 months before the date that we're supposed to go live, building a website, trying to put as much information out there as possible.
Okay, now on the website, my time is so limited, my apologies.
Sorry.
What I want to get is very specific about the budget that you put forward. In this document, which is just 7 pages, it has just 10 line items. The two biggest line items are full-time permanent positions, followed by personnel benefits. That accounts for about $225 million in expenses. Third item is contractual services, which has a very specific number of $48,907,000. Where is the detail about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it? So how do we find the breakdown of that number and how you're going to organize this agency? Because you've obviously got some specificity in the numbers. We're looking for the documents, the transparency, and how you're actually going to do that.
So, Congressman, let me try this at 2 levels, and you tell me if this is helpful, and if it's not, I'll try a different way. The first level is to describe, in a big sense, where we will be spending money in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and if you just think of it like a pie.
I'm worried about the fine print, the details. The Appropriations Committee, this Oversight Committee, we don't have the details of how you're actually going to organize and put this forward. Let me read, for instance, go ahead.
So also, Congressman, and I'm afraid I'm blocking on the name, but every contract issued by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is done, as you would know, through the ordinary competitive process, when appropriate, through procurement.
But in advance of those contracts, for instance, this is directly from the House Appropriations Committee. Unlike other agencies, the Consumer Financial Protection Board does not describe or explain a relationship between its policy objectives and the budgetary resources. Performance measures or goals, significant proposals that affect obligations in the 5 to 10 year period and their relationship to the current year and budget year, or the budgetary effect of workload, strategic planning, capital planning, or investment in an information technology. How do we get the details of all of this information? You obviously have a top-line number, and that was based on something, but you seem to be hiding the details of how you came up with those numbers.
Congressman, no one's hiding anything. We publish all contracts in, it's not called the Federal Register, there's a special place these are published, but
I'm not talking about the contracts. You have only on your website for consumer. I'm worried about the person who's out, in Albuquerque or in Provo, Utah. How do they find out the makeup of all these numbers and the details? As the Appropriations Committee suggested, they can't see that information. I doubt the public can see it either.
Then they may want to go to www.usaspending.gov. It will list the type of contract, the awardee, and the amount of the contract. They may also want to...
What about all these other items, for instance, not just the contracts, performance measures and goals, budgetary resources, what are these people going to be, where do we find all that information? Because it's not on the website compared to other agencies.
Congressman, we're in the process, for example, of developing our performance metrics. And we are not yet standing up as an agency, but as soon as we are stood up, we are putting as much of this as possible.
So are you saying by next week you're going to have this?
Let me say it this way, Congressman.
You just said you would have it when you stand up, and that's next week. So are you telling me that this will be available next week?
Congressman, I don't want to overpromise because I'm not sure how many things you read. I'm not familiar with the document you're reading from.
You're not familiar with the appropriations report?
Of course, I try to stay up with the appropriations work. I'm not sure what particular paragraphs and lines.
You're going to hand that to you right here. It's the budget justification, which is dramatically different than any other agency moving forward.
I'm sorry, Congressman, is this
your document?
This is our document.
Yes.
I think you were reading from something else, sir.
But based on your giving that document to the Appropriations Committee said, unlike other agencies, and it listed out all the other things that they normally see, that we normally see as members of the Oversight Committee, and all of that is absent.
Congressman,
point of information. Mr. Chairman, could we get a copy of this document to also look at it so we could understand the questioning?
Sure.
Yeah.
We'll give it.
And could I also ask, is there a request outstanding from the Appropriations Committee
That's my understanding,
for more
yes.
information?
Yes, and I think this committee is also asking for that same sort of transparency.
Congressman, if that's the case, we would be glad to come back. We would be glad to brief you. We would be glad to work with you in order to find something that is adequately transparent both to Congress and to the American people.
I have to yield back. My time has expired, but I would hope that information be on the website for the public as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.
Mr.